Hello and welcome. To understand the content in this channel, it's important to get the whole picture, and this video forms the base on which that is formed. The viewpoints are mine, but based on some 50 years experience across the whole spectrum of road driving in the UK. The previous video finished on the point that probably over 90% of crashes involve driver error. Problem is that most of those drivers will probably say it wasn't my fault, suitably aided and abetted by the insurance companies, which say fault should never be admitted. And yet I know people who could not go to each other and say it wasn't my fault. There is obviously a massive gap, and equally one of safety. So, if the major issue is driver error, what if up to 90% of that error could be eliminated? The military have a saying, the mind controls the body. If that's the case, it might also mean that of the 1,711 who died on the UK roads in 2022, some 1,500 might still be alive today. A simplistic and idealistic viewpoint perhaps, but what if the essence is sound? Libby Purvis recently interviewed Colonel Chris Hadfield, who is a man of great depth and width of experience, having been an astronaut, commander of the space station, a fighter pilot, and is also an engineer. Purvis asked what singular comment he might have about fear. He replied, "The greatest antidote to fear is competence." This basically means where people and machines are concerned, there can be conflict. It's hard things coming into contact with soft things, either inside or outside. It's proven that training and competencies reduce incidents, which further means that levels of competence proportionally reduce the vulnerability to incidents. This is interesting because at the beginning of the D12 Associate Training Manual, which was used in groups where I was training officer and written in the late 70s, is this statement: to the average driver, safe means not having had a crash. To the skilled driver, safe means not being vulnerable to a crash. Talking about better road driving skills improving safety doesn't work with most people, because the standard reply is often, "I am safe because I haven't had a crash." End of conversation. Then one looks at the general standard of road driving and says, that definition just does not stack up. However, once safety is defined in terms of vulnerability, it alters the whole perspective, because vulnerability can be put on a scale, whereas safe tends to be binary, either you are or you are not. In my experience, there is that direct relationship between levels of competence and vulnerabilities to crashes. So let's examine what there might be on a scale of competences between these two extremes. The ones who will inevitably say it wasn't my fault, and those who could not go to their peers with excuses. Let's start by looking from the bottom up, because that's where most will be coming from. Partly for the reason just mentioned, the average driver is generally not motivated to gain any competency over and above the standard or DVSA driving tests. In my view, this is partly because what is best described as a delusion of safety. There's a lot more vulnerability to crashes out there than most realise, and yet it seems many travel along blissfully unaware. Combine this with the law of averages, which seems to greatly favour the unwary, the thoughtless, the injudicious, the seriously injudicious, and the outright dangerous, and very lucky for them and all concerned that it does, partly because each fatal crash costs the taxpayer some £2 million. 1,500 lives saved would also save the Exchequer some £3 billion, and that's not taking into account the massive saving in the mental collateral damage to relatives and friends. Have a look at this clip. It will play twice, the first silently and then with analysis. There were 3 drivers, all of whom might have contributed in some way to a crash, but none of which seemed to have recognized the scenario and went blithely on their way without further thought. It's just one example of regularly seen scenarios. Another part is that unfortunately there are influential sectors within the professional driving instruction industry which, for commercial and or egotistical reasons, often actively deny there is anything worth knowing beyond the standard DVSA driving test. And most of the road safety industry seems to follow meekly in the wake of this mindset. In turn, this lack of understanding can lead to some bizarre suggestions for improving road safety, but that's another story. All this means that if we're looking from the bottom up, we come to a grinding halt at the level of the standard driving test. However, by some reference points, this is just an entry level. As one former advanced course police driving instructor put it, it is the lowest level of competence for driving on UK roads, apart from being the area where the 90% driver errors occur, and where most of those will probably say, it wasn't my fault. The maths clearly does not add up. It's also estimated that most drivers, if spot tested today, would fail that basic test of competence, which, by inference, is also a basic level of safety. You might now start to appreciate that there might be much more out there in competence and skill levels than just a standard driving test. And you would generally not get the best perspective by looking from the lowest level. To do that, you have to look from the top down. Those who take full responsibility for their situation and know they could not go to their peers with excuses are also professional driving instructors, but of the very highest caliber. They have to be for the work they do. There is no 100% rule, but in terms of safety, I would put those I knew and former ones I know today as close to that as you can get, so let's make it 98%. On the scale of vulnerability, that would put their potential for crashes at around, say, 2%. To reach that level, they've gone through multiple stages of focus training, each one adding a level of competence. These are advanced course police driving instructors. By the same token, we can equate the 90% driver error zone with the standard DVSA driving test level. The next down on the scale of obviously those taught by those instructors, notice specifically police traffic patrol officers with their advanced ticket, followed by, as it used to be, the intermediate course, and starting with the standard course, what is now effectively the standard response course. All of these can obviously work above the national speed limit. Then we come to the civilian advanced courses, the highest of which probably equates with at least the police standard response course below the national speed limit. For simplicity, I'm putting their relative standards roughly on a par. Top of the civilian advanced levels are IAM Masters and ROSPA Gold. These are followed by the standard IAM test and ROSPA Silver. Finally, there is ROSPA Bronze, which can be considered perhaps a margin above the standard DVSA driving test. Now let's put some numbers on the scale, because that gives a perspective on where the standard driving test might sit in relation to the whole range of competencies in road driving or riding. We can also see a graphical representation of the diminishing levels of vulnerability as one moves up the scale. If the ones at 90% on the scale equal, say, 2% vulnerability, then you can do the maths on the rest. This is obviously not meant to be precise, and is obviously not scientific, but to my mind it's a good enough pointer regarding the general perspective and scale. Given this perspective, we can just as well call the standard DVSA driving test the basic driving test. This is a simplified version of the 100 scale. The fuller version comes later. However, it should be apparent that even in the civilian sector there is a lot more available in skills and competencies than just the basic driving test, with a proportional reduction in vulnerability to crashes as one progresses up the scale. This means that, except in very rare cases, there is generally little or no excuse for having crashes when the information, competence levels and skill sets for reducing vulnerability are well established, proven and readily available for all who wish to find them. Here are 3 questions. Where are you on the scale? Where would you like to be on it? And if you're not where you would like to be, are you prepared to do something about it? Each year, some 30,000 people are either killed or seriously injured in road crashes. I will leave you with a thought. Earlier I said there is no 100% rule, but it is probably a fair bet that some 80 people would not have left home today if they knew that by the end of it they would be either seriously injured or dead. Which is particularly sad when, but for a few more skills, most might not have been involved in a road crash. Which means skills and competencies reduce crashes.